our masters all, a godly crew whose hearts throb for the poor. Their sympathies assure us too, if our demands were fewer. Most generous souls, but please observe what they enjoy from birth is all we ever had the nerve to ask, that is the earth. The labor fakir, full of guile, such doctrine ever preaches, and whilst he leads the rank and file, tame moderation teaches. In his despite we'll see the day when, with sword in its girth, labor shall march in war array to seize its own the earth. For labor long with groans and tears to its oppressors knelt, but never yet to odds he fears did hear our tyrant melt. We need not kneel, our cause is high, of true man there's no dearth, and our victorious rallying cry shall be, we want the earth.
Sends you an omen. A revolution just arrived like the morning. Ring the alarm, we come to wake up the snoring. They're telling you to never worry about the future. They're telling you to never worry about the torture. They're telling you that you will never see the horror. Spend it all today and we will bill you tomorrow. 3-piece suits and bank accounts in Bahamas. Wall Street crime will never send you to the slammer. Tell all the children in the arms of the mamas, the F-15 is a homicide bomber. TV commercial for a popper pill culture. Drug companies circling like a vulture. Amaraki babies with the G.I. Joe father. 10 years from now, is anybody gonna bother your fire? Yo, 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 yo. Yeah, fire. Yo, 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 yo. Yeah, fire. Yo, 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 yo. Yeah, fire. Never come with a warning. A revolution never sends you an omen. A revolution never come with a warning. A revolution. Everyone addicted to the same nicotine. Everyone addicted to the same gasoline. Everyone addicted to a Technicolor screen. Everybody trying to get their hands on the same green. From the banks of the river to the banks of the greedy. All of the rich is taken back by the needy. We come from the country and we come from the city. Play us on a record, you can play us on a CD. All the shit you giving us is fertilizer. The seeds that you planted, you can never brutalize them. Tell the corporation you can never globalize it. Like Peter Tosh said, legalize it. Girls and boys hear the bass and the treble, rumbling the speakers in and make you wanna rebel. Throw your hands up, take it to another level, and you never ever ever make a deal with the devil. Yeah, fire. Yo, 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 yo. Yeah, fire. Yo, 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 yo. Yeah, fire. Yo, yo, yo. with a warning. Revolution never send you an omen. Revolution never come with a warning. Yeah, fire, yo, 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 yo. 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 Revolution never come with a warning. Revolution never send you an omen. Revolution just arise like the morning. Show me a line, they come to wake up the storm. Fire.
All right, so that is an abrupt ending to Michael Franti, Yell Fire, and we heard the songs of James Connolly, Our Demands Most Moderate Are, We Only Want the Earth, which seemed like an appropriate way to begin an event for Earth Week 2021, an Earth Week in which labor and ecological concerns are coming together at a level in which they have not, at least in my memory. My name is Ben Manski. I'm an assistant professor of sociology here at George Mason University. I'm very pleased to be here with colleagues, with friends, with neighbors, with many of you who are interested in this conversation today about the next system and the academy. I want to acknowledge our co-sponsors. There are so many that I had to create a slide, which some of you who arrived early were able to see, and we'll talk a little bit more about the partnerships that have come together through this event. I want to notify everybody that this event tonight is recorded and it will be posted and shared widely. I also want to extend an invitation to everybody who has registered for this session tonight to join an open discussion in which there can be more back and forth and exchange on Friday that is organized by the Graduate Student Sociological Association at George Mason University and the Public Sociology Association. They're holding a fireside chat. You will get an email about that if you registered. And I want to, of course, acknowledge that not only is this Earth Week and part of a series of events of Earth Day to May Day, and also Take Back the Night tonight at this campus and many other campuses, but also to begin by acknowledging the First Nations of this region, the many, many Algonquin speaking peoples of this region, and the more than 30,000 self-identified Indigenous peoples of Virginia today. I want to acknowledge 200 years of chattel slavery, of African slavery here in Virginia, and acknowledge the more than 100,000 who died in the fields of Virginia in the Civil War, acknowledge a century and a half of struggles of oppressed peoples and of refugees from oppression who came here to build better lives. Many of our students at George Mason University are first-generation Americans and first-generation college students. I also want to acknowledge that we are here today to not only talk about building better lives, but to talk about building a better world. And in order to do that, we need to take stock. So I will read the following to you. In coming years and decades, the world will face more intense and cascading global challenges, ranging from disease to climate change, to the disruptions from new technologies and financial crises. These challenges will repeatedly test the resilience and adaptability of communities, states, and the international system, often exceeding the capacity of existing systems and models. This looming disequilibrium between existing and future challenges and the ability of institutions and systems to respond is likely to grow and produce greater contestation at every level. That is not a statement of the Next System Project or of any left-wing organization. That is the Global Trends Report of the US intelligence community that was issued last week. So what we are here to talk about tonight is something quite radical, something quite serious, something that is shared by people both at the top and the bottom. There are new alliances that are being formed. And it's in that light that I wish to extend an invitation. And I want to confirm that we have with us Representative Mark Pocan, and I can see that he is here with us today. So I'm going to introduce him. He is somebody who comes from the bottom, from struggles, but is now a member of Congress. As a state legislator, as my state legislator in Madison, Wisconsin, he led the fight against supermax prisons. He was a leader in the Wisconsin uprising of 2011. As a member of Congress, he has led on workplace democracy, the right to organize, reclaiming congressional war powers, for human rights abroad and equal rights at home, for the abolition of ICE. Representative Pocan was the initial sponsor of the We the People amendment that makes clear that corporations are not persons and money is not speech for the purposes of the Bill of Rights. Representative Pocan speaks on the House Appropriations Committee and 3 of its subcommittees, as well as on the House Education and Labor Committee. He co-chairs the Labor Caucus and the Cooperative Business Caucus in Congress. And he does that as somebody who is both a business owner and a lifelong union member. Representative Pocan is here to address what policymakers and elected officials expect and need from our academic institutions in order to better serve the will and the needs of all the people. Please welcome Representative Mark Pocan.
Thank you very much, Ben. And sorry about that last minute scramble. Apparently Zoom has an update that happened just as I came to do this, and I've been on Zoom all day. So the timing was very interesting, but really glad to be here with everyone. And just want to say, first of all, thank you to Ben. I've known Ben for a very long time, he and Sarah, and watch Ben continue to grow and do really amazing things on behalf of democracy and progressive politics and progressive values, really. And thank you so much for that, Ben. I want to thank George Mason University, the fellow presenters, and very happy to be with you all this afternoon. America needs, obviously, to transition to a more democratic, sustainable, and just society, especially in this moment of time. When you look at the issues that we're facing, an ongoing global pandemic partnered with an economic side effect of that pandemic, racial inequalities that are reckoning. As of yesterday, we fortunately saw a good verdict that, as I think my good friend Keith Ellison said, hopefully opens the door to have a restart button on how we treat races in this country. But clearly, it wasn't justice. Justice would be George Floyd being alive. Justice would be a lot more than what we had. But clearly, this country has huge racial inequalities. We have a lack of economic opportunities for way too many people in places like Wisconsin. Too many manufacturing jobs left decades ago and haven't been replaced. And too many people are still hurting. And unfortunately, they're taking easy solutions to figure out why that happened. We have inadequate social support programs, from healthcare to go down the list. There's just too many things that need serious assistance to make people have the quality of life that we really want, so that they can support their family and have every opportunity for them. And our infrastructure is literally crumbling. How many times do we hear Donald Trump during the Trump administration say he's going to have infrastructure week, only to not? And even now, an infrastructure package at $2 trillion is still a fraction of what we need to make sure that it's not just roads and bridges, but schools and broadband and water delivery systems. Go down the list of things, human infrastructure needs that are out there. There's just many. And one of the biggest problems that I feel we're facing is how we as policymakers get our information. There are almost 12,000 registered lobbyists in Washington, D.C. That's about 28 per House member. That's a lot of lobbyists. And that is really what so often drives the decisions in this town, whether it be the special interests and where they donate their campaigns, or just where you get your information. If the people who are in the halls of Congress, literally on a regular basis, are folks that represent that 12,000, that's a real problem. $4 billion is spent annually on lobbying. And you can imagine the number of times those returns happen to those special interests that hire them. And as of now, only 52 House members have pledged not to take corporate PAC money. But to be honest, it was less than a handful probably 4 years ago. So that's progress, but still, that's a little over 10% of Congress in a position to not have to have that direct connection and influence that's all too often happens from these special interests. They don't give it because they like my look. And I don't take their PAC money, but it's certainly a real problem we have here. As a result, we've watched how Congress has acted. In the last 8 years that I've been in Congress, we've watched those same issues continue to be the same issues that we don't address. Here we are a year into a global pandemic, and we understand the need for healthcare and why every person has to have access to healthcare. We are the only industrialized nation that doesn't have a universal healthcare system. And the reason I know that, I was PolitiFacted and I was given a true on that. And yet, where are we on Medicare for All? Still with a little over 120, I believe, sponsors for a bill that you need 218 votes to pass into Congress. But clearly, in the last year, we've all seen the need for healthcare that doesn't depend on how much money you make or what job you have, but it depends on us as a society. We still haven't addressed climate change. And, there's warning signs everywhere. How many times do we have to be told by people from your parts of life that we are perhaps past the no return point as a planet to be able to continue? And yet we still are busy worrying about what oil and gas lobbyists think or what other special interests think and why we can't proceed with something substantive when the evidence is overwhelming. We can't pass something as simple as a minimum wage increase since 2009. Here we are 12 years later with a minimum wage that hasn't gone up, that someone working full-time at minimum wage is making $15,000 a year and likely not having benefits to boot. And yet it's a major debate in the halls of Congress whether or not we can raise the minimum wage. And among some of the newer Q and Tea Party folks, whether we should have a minimum wage, by the way, is the debate. And we also have growing costs on drug prices. The fact that we are paying 20 times what you can pay in Canada and other countries, and yet we're not fixing that in the country where most of the drug companies have used research. In fact, every single drug approved in the last decade by the National Institutes of Health, or I'm sorry, by the FDA, has had support from the National Institutes of Health. And yet we're still facing those crises. So it really is so many decisions that we need to move forward on. We're not. And I feel that so much of that is due to where Congress, where staff, where committees get their information. It's often from those 12,000 registered lobbyists and the organizations that they represent is where we see that information coming. And, there are a lot of other issues that also get in the way that aren't even a direct policy issue, but they affect how we move forward. Things like pay-go rules, the idea that somehow we have to pay for any new initiative rather than realizing some of the more current theories like modern monetary theory and ideas that we could actually be looking at where by investing in things we could be bringing in greater returns, but we still are very much stuck on an old antiquated idea of how we need to move forward. So I just want to give you 3 examples I want to kind of go through of where we see this problem very directly and why we're looking to folks like yourselves to help us with answers, because until we can break how we get the information, you're not going to realistically expect to see different answers. And unfortunately, it's tied into how our campaigns are and where the information comes in. And it's very much tied to the special interest influence here in Washington, D.C. First, big pharma and healthcare. Healthcare is a human right as far as I'm concerned. I am a strong supporter of Medicare for All. One of our most popular federal programs is Medicare. It works very well. In fact, it should go farther. Go into things like vision and dental and long-term care and other areas. And the bill that's introduced in Congress does just that. But there's no question that healthcare is a human right. And yet people are still struggling to afford basic healthcare and prescription drugs. We pay more than any country in the world for the care we get and for the drugs that we get for healthcare. And greed is not the reason necessarily. Greed is the reason. It's not production costs or distribution problems. it really is what these companies are profiting on, and often where they then later hide their profits in another country. Just one example is the Gilead Hep C drug. The government spent $4 million on research that aided the development of that drug. And after the company's rollout, Gilead worldwide revenues tripled from 11 billion to 33 billion dollars. And US taxpayers paid at least 5 billion annually for that overpriced drug, while thousands of patients went without it because of the cost of that drug. And as those sales exploded, Gilead shifted its profits then offshore to dodge paying taxes, likely more than $10 billion alone in taxes that they were able to avoid in the first few years as that Hep C drug was on the market. And people are starting to demand change, but we just got to look at past fights, from the EpiPen to insulin. Of those 12,000 lobbyists, 1,500 alone are in big pharma, and that's 3 for every member of the House and Senate. I don't know who my 3 are, but that's pretty screwed up. And it really illustrates part of the problem that we're facing. On military spending, recently Barbara Lee and I formed a Pentagon Spending Reduction Caucus to try to get at the ever-increasing Pentagon budget. In the last cycle, what we approved was $740 billion for the Pentagon. That's a 20% increase at a time of relative peace during the Trump administration. And yet we still have about a 1.7% increase under the Biden administration in defense. When you look at the companies that are in every single district and the lobbyists they have and the special interest influence they have, we have people wanting to buy more weaponry and spend more with private contractors than even the Department of Defense has requested, which makes no sense. We've seen that we already spend more than the next 10 countries combined on our defense. And you'll hear the rhetoric about China and Russia, but clearly when you're spending what we're spending, there is a clear difference in those dollars. Just one example is I have a company in my district that makes a little part that goes on submarines and aircraft carriers that's about the size of your pinky. They come in every year and ask me to buy more aircraft carriers and submarines than requested by the Department of Defense. And that, again, is part of why we don't see a real reduction in defense spending, although we did have 90 people in the last session vote to try to reduce defense spending by 10%. Many would argue you could still have a significantly stronger cut to do that. Finally, the third area is environmental legislation. People really get this. People can understand a Green New Deal. They understand that our planet's in crisis, that we were able to, as a country, get together and do a New Deal during Franklin Roosevelt's time in office, and they understand the connection and the ability to do that. And yet we still can't, because we still subsidize fossil fuel industry. We still, to this day, are doing that. There are tax breaks for industries that clearly are making billions and billions of profits and are some of the biggest polluters. Most recently, we've had a number of our members, especially Progressive Caucus members, introduce measures to try to get at specific parts of this, but we're really facing a very uphill climb. I can tell you from meeting after meeting after meeting I have, people are still looking out for their own industry and don't want to think bigger and bolder that we're going to move forward. They should be changing, not asking us not to change. And yet, if you look at the movement on big environmental ideas, it's really lacking in a Congress that gives it a lot of talk, but not a lot of substance. So how can we support big ideas like that and changing that? Well, one is we have to change this focus from where Congress gets information and where it gets support from campaigns to reforming the process to a place where we're getting information from people like yourselves that are experts who are bringing facts and facts alone, without the bias, without the money, without the influence that we currently see. I'm hoping that as you all have your conversations, you really take a strong look at that, because until we do things like pass substantial campaign finance reform, get rid of the Citizens United decision that allowed corporations to essentially be people in campaigns, until we really change the way that special interests have an extra way into offices that no one else has, it's going to be very, very difficult to change that information process and where it comes in. And I can tell you that we need those bold ideas coming in. We have to address prescription drugs in a way that doesn't just profit boards of directors of companies that then hide those profits overseas. We have to figure out how to actually address wind and solar and biomass and all the alternatives that are out there in a way that creates jobs right here in America. What could be more popular, you would think? Well, apparently special interest lobbyists. They're more popular, or at least more effective in getting that message across because of the current system that we have. And when it comes to defense spending, I can tell you, we for 10 years lived under the sequester that just ended. The sequester was something done before I got to Congress because Congress couldn't get a budget together that said if you cut $1 on defense, you had to cut $1 on non-defense discretionary spending, which meant education and housing and healthcare. So for a 10-year period, while they thought that would bring Congress together to get something done, it did just the opposite. It made no one touch anything. And we instead now have a defense budget that's ballooned over those years because of having that in place. That now is done. That provides a real opportunity. But now we have to break that connection of all those special interests in everyone's district, talking about jobs rather than the national good. I'm really here just to say we need your help in the future. There's no question we can't go forward continuing to get that information from people who are acting in their best interest, not in the nation's best interest. And so often when we do get data that works and helps us, it comes from think tanks that come out of universities, it comes from some nonprofit organizations, but none of those seem to have that extra clout all too often in some of these key areas where we need to have change. So I just wanted to be able to come here today, not just to say, there's plenty that we need to reform, but to ask for your help and how to get that reform so that we can get to a point that we're going to the academics and to the folks that don't necessarily have a financial gain out of this, but have the ability to give us the next generation of ideas, because we can't just keep operating in a way that's based on making sure that special interests continue to profit in the way that they do. And instead, we have to figure out a way to move forward so that the average person can continue to be able to support their family with a family supporting wage in a way that provides them opportunity and can really move the nation forward. So Ben, I really appreciate being with you in between votes here. It's always interesting in Washington, but very glad to be with everyone. And I wish you the best as you're moving forward and looking at next generation ideas of how to be able to move this country forward. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, Mark, for taking time out of your very busy schedule to keynote this discussion tonight. And thanks for all your work on behalf of the public interest in Congress over the years and in the years to come.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Yeah.
Take care.
You bet. So we have a sense, I think, from Congress of some of the difficulties that legislators who come from the people, there are still many millionaires and few working class people in Congress in relative terms. And we heard from one of those people who comes from working class background, from the background of the majority of the people of this country. There are a lot of difficulties I think I could hear that Mark Pocan was speaking to in terms of moving reform. These are difficulties that have that are embedded in a political system which is dysfunctional, as I think we all know, and frankly most Americans know, according to survey data, and certainly members of Congress who are trying to make reforms know intimately. Mark Pocan and I, and also one of the major panelists today, come from a state in which there was a heritage of the university playing a direct role in informing the politics that goes on in the state legislature and the state capitol, but also historically in the New Deal. Representative Pocan referenced the New Deal of the 1930s. And of course, many of those reforms came out of research and practice that University of Wisconsin sociologists and economists built in the early part of the 20th century in collaboration with social movements. They came in from outside of the political system and built alternatives and showed that other ways of doing things could not only work, but work better. And then they were able to pilot those alternatives at the state level, and then when they had the opportunity to bring it to Washington in the 1930s. So it's in that vein that I am very pleased to have the opportunity to share a little bit briefly about what we're doing here at George Mason. To talk more about this event, I wanted to get directly into Pocan's remarks, Representative Pocan's remarks, and then to turn it over to our major panelists. So I'm going to pull up another set of slides, which you will see here in a moment. There we go. And you should be seeing Diane Fujino's face, but I'm going to turn this to a slideshow. So first of all, let me just say again, thank you so much to our co-hosts, the Center for Social Science Research, the Democratizing NOVA Project, the Department of Sociology and Anthropology here at George Mason University, our many co-sponsors at George Mason University, and there are student organizations, there are programs, there are programs that are actually in other schools. This has been an interesting organizing project to build this event today. There are many relationships here at George Mason University that have gotten built through putting this event together. We also had many people reach out to us as we were organizing and publicizing this session from other universities and academic institutions, from the University of California system, from a network of academics in the Pacific Northwest, from the University of Vermont and McGill University with Leadership for the Ecozoic, from the University of Minnesota Duluth in a region close to my heart. And so one thing I can tell you is that there will be follow-up from this event tonight, and many of those ties and other ties that exist in terms of scholarship and communities that are interested in next system studies will be built upon. So this is just a beginning in that sense. I also want to thank especially our community-based sponsors, the Democracy Collaborative, the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network, Move to Amend, Liberty Tree, Cooperation Humboldt, the Alliance for Democracy, Round Sky Solutions, and Warehouse Workers for Justice, who really helped to build awareness of this event tonight nationally and to some extent internationally. We have over 400 people who registered, so we do have a good list to follow up with, and you will be hearing back from me and from us in the coming days and weeks. Next, I just want to say a little bit about what we're doing here at George Mason University. We have a series of new programs that we are introducing this year and in the coming year. The Democratizing NOVA project I mentioned just now, it's a community engaged research project dedicated to building community, economic, and political democracy in Northern Virginia. I want to acknowledge our graduate student team, Kelly Wilkerson, Fanny Farrago, Chris Cleland, Katiana Falsetti, Patrick Healy, and Denver Supinger, who have been working on a weekly basis to build a project to assess efforts in Northern Virginia to democratize our communities, our economy, and our politics, and then to take that assessment and use it as the basis to lean in and provide institutional support to next system initiatives in the region. We're also offering the first course in Next System Studies at an academic institution in just a few weeks in our summer session A, Social Change in the Next System. I know many of our undergraduates and graduate students are here tonight, and if you are registered, I look forward to seeing you in that class, and I encourage others to register before we max out. There's a lot of interest in the course, and then that will help us to build a new cohort of Next System Fellows in the spring of 2022. George Mason University is the largest public university in the state of Virginia. We are an R1 university with multiple campuses, and at the Arlington campus, right across the Potomac from DC, there is an Arlington Fellows program, and the Next System Fellows will join the Arlington Fellows next spring. So we're very excited about all of this. And now I get to turn to the part that will really put a smile on my face and I think on all of your faces, to introduce our major panelists and also our academic response panelists. And I'll tell you a little bit about the format tonight. Each of our major panelists will speak for up to 15 minutes. And I'm going to introduce them now. And then that way, when we're in the panel mode, I will just I'll save some time. So you'll get a little bit of a bio right now, and then we'll go into the full panel. And then following that, we have our academic response panel, and they will each also take up to 15 minutes to respond. I've asked them to talk at some length because there's a reason why I asked them to serve on our academic response panel. They have things to bring from the academy that I think we need to think about and hear. And then we'll open it up in a discussion that our academic response panelists will lead with the rest of our panelists. So that's the format tonight. When we move into that discussion period, we're going to open up the chat broadly, so you'll be able to interact with each other, those who are participating tonight. And of course, this is just another step, and in some ways a beginning, so there will be further discussions, conferences, and sessions in the future. So our first panelist tonight will be Kali Akuno, who is a co-founder and co-director of Cooperation Jackson, and he's co-editor of Jackson Rising, the Struggle for Economic Democracy and Black Self-Determination in Jackson, Mississippi. He served as the Director of Special Projects and External Funding in the mayoral administration of the late Chokwe Lumumba of Jackson. I'm not going to read the whole set of panels, but I just want to say to Kali Akuno, there are many people I know who are very excited to hear from you tonight. And I've been talking you and each of the panelists up quite a bit here at George Mason as well. So I'm looking forward to your remarks. Next, we'll have Gar Alperovitz, who is the other Wisconsinite here tonight in terms of panelists. Gar has had a very distinguished career as a historian, political economist, activist, writer, and government official. I will just say personally that something that I say in introducing Gar again to my students and to others, much of the history of the late 20th century is a history that Gar was a part of. So if you have worked on community development, chances are you have been touched by something that Gar had a hand in. If you have participated in Earth Day, then you have been touched by something that Gar had a hand in. If you have read the speeches of Dr. King, then you have some relation to Gar through that. But Gar Alperovitz is also an intellectual inspiration for the next system studies research and projects based in communities and also in the academy. Not our third panelist, but the third person I'm going to introduce tonight is Peter Knowlton. I'm very happy that Peter was able to join us on short notice. We had some switch ups in terms of our lineup tonight, but this is certainly one that adds in many respects to our conversation. He was a member of the United Electrical, Radio, and Machine Workers of America for 34 years until his retirement in 2019. Peter just stepped down this past, just the other year, as the general president of United Electrical Workers. United Electrical Workers is a special union for many reasons, but one reason that is particular to, there's a particular interest in our discussions tonight, is that UE has a history of working for worker ownership. This is a union that is not just about serving the needs of members, and is not just about social change and building a larger sort of momentum for social change in society, but is also very much committed to transforming our workplaces into more democratic spaces. So I'm very happy that you are joining us tonight. Our final major panelist who will be speaking third is Mike Strode. Mike Strode is a writer, urban cyclist facilitator, and solidarity economy organizer with the Cola Nut Collaborative, and he resides in Southeast Chicago. The Cola Nut Collaborative is Chicago's only time-based service and skills exchange, otherwise known as a time bank, providing an open platform for mutual aid, community organizing, and network weaving. I have had the opportunity to meet Mike and to sit in conversations with him over this past year in a number of different settings. And one thing that Mike brings to the cooperative sector that I think is quite important is sort of the application of technological skills and development to community-based needs and organizing. And so there's a lot of innovation that I know you've been a part of that is been picked up and that I'm looking forward to learning more about tonight and in the future. And I really appreciate you stepping in tonight as well. In terms of our academic response panel, again, not in the order of speaking, but Dr. Amy Best is professor of sociology and chair in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at George Mason University. One thing that I came to learn when I arrived at George Mason University is that This department really is committed to public sociology. It is one of very few programs that I am aware of that has worked to make public sociology not just sort of a part of the discourse, but a part of the functioning of everything that happens here. And so really looking forward to your contributions tonight, Dr. Best. And then finally, Dr. Diane Fujino, who is professor of Asian American Studies and former director of the Center for Black Studies Research at UC Santa Barbara, the University of California, Santa Barbara, written many wonderful books. But one of the reasons why I was very happy that Dr. Fujino agreed to join us tonight was that she has been directly engaged in projects in Santa Barbara with Cooperation Santa Barbara and other efforts to build university community collaborations that really make people's lives better in the here and now and shift power. And I'm very much looking forward to your contributions tonight as well. So that is my introduction to our session. I'm going to stop the share and I'm going to turn it over to Kali Akuno, assuming that you are able to get your video. It looks like you are. Thank you so much, Kali, for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here. Let's see where to begin. Let me start with, I guess, just a few declarative statements, at least from my perspective. I think we are in the midst of one of the most important decades. You know, granted, the measurement of time is kind of a cultural bound phenomenon, but to the extent that we've been counting decades, I think this is one of the most important in our history, given the nature of the systemic crisis that we are confronting and how they are rapidly escalating in terms of, you know, civil strife and civil conflict due to the increasing challenge to democracy in all corners of the globe as we see it now, with many right-wing figureheads and movements, not just figureheads, but movements emerging to try to clamp down on the democratic aspirations of people all over the world, but in definite response to the limiting dynamics of the economic system that we are presently living within, and the challenges that come with, let's just name it as it is, really kind of a collapsing ecosystem and climate change. And these are breeding, without strong visionary political leadership, some of the worst reactionary policies that we can see on a global scale, from the xenophobia, you know, to the increased brutality and racism all around the world, not just here in the United States. You know, Fortress Europe, Fortress America, the erection of borders that keep people out, the inhumane treatment of folks who are seeking refuge, trying to cross the Mediterranean or trying to cross parts of the Indian Ocean or the Pacific Ocean. We see these things cropping up. And in that vein, I think we have to take this kind of battle of ideas very, very seriously. Now that's, you know, easier said than done, but I think we really have to do everything we can in every medium that we can to get out new ideas. And some of them, let's acknowledge, are not that new. Cooperatives are really not that new. You know, they've just been kind of contained and constrained and downplayed and often castigated by certain circles who don't want to see collective decision-making or don't want to see a democratic economy. But it's elevating these things, and I think really struggling to get these out more and more into the mainstream and deeper into our communities is going to be critical, because what we've seen, you know, just in the United States, there's a deeper levels. I know we see it in our communities where, in effect, it's almost like this erection of social media has kind of both created a vacuum and filled a vacuum, you know, and a lot of misinformation has been pumped into that, you know, which is steering people into deep conspiracy theories, QAnon, all range of things. And somehow, some way, we are not doing an effective job of intervening in this kind of vacuum and putting out enough of our ideas and then matching them with just basic elements of practice, I think, to sway, many millions of folks in a new direction. And that is a critical part of what we have to do. Now that's one kind of declarative statement. The other piece, I think, building on the first speaker, is contextualization, right? And how do we intervene in creating the change that we want to make? Now, I'm one who advocates that we have to have a global perspective, a global view, a global analysis, but we have to tie that into the most, deepest, complex, local grounded work that we can, and to build those two together, right? To build the links that link those together. But we really have to start, I think, particularly in this country, with a solid grounding in our communities, because so much of the communal bonds that existed in large parts of the 20th century, 19th century, so much of that was broken by, what I would call the neoliberal kind of cultural project, not just economic project, but the cultural project over the last 50 years, which has really broken down communities and forced us all into kind of like individuated, atomized relationships that are really mediated more by the market than through social relationships. And these are some things that we're going to have to intentionally recreate. And working on a particular level and scale, I think, of context, and knowing your context is important. And let me just cite a reason why. We've been very much grounded in trying to elevate a municipalist politics very explicitly here, in Jackson, that are based upon our analysis and read of our demographics, of our economy. And I think, all being said, the last 10 years, I think the decades that those who came before me and the decades that I spent, doing kind of prep, the last 10 years saw a lot of fruitful outcomes in terms of cooperative development, in terms of getting elected officials, who share our views in politics in office. But now it's being met with some new challenges. Our success is being met with some new challenges. I'm in Mississippi, for those of you who don't know. In Mississippi is a state dominated by ultra-right, libertarian fanatics, I think is the only way you could really put it. And what they have really taken to, as a countermeasure to, I think, kind of the bubbling, kind of strengthened example that was being set here in Jackson, is they're really now into preventative politics. And what do I mean by that? So the several unions in the city that were part of the Fight for 15 campaign, leading that struggle here for many years, were making some serious traction and headway here in Jackson to get the city to mandate a $15 minimum wage. About 2 years ago, it looks like we were on the verge of attaining that here in Jackson. Well, along steps in the state, and they introduced some preventative legislation on a state level, because the Republicans, these Tea Party, ultra libertarian, ultra right-wing conservative, they have a supermajority now because of gerrymandering in the state of Mississippi. And so they propose and pass some preventative politics, which now says that no municipality can come up with its own wage scale. Everything has to be determined on a state level, right? And they've done similar measures with ideas that we've put forth about Green New Deal and other things, where they've come up with this preventative policy. And so it's really put us in this new position of, in our context, trying to perfect the practice of creating the alternatives, rather than trying to, necessarily propose legislation that they would automatically block. And so we're trying to just really double down on creating the best examples that we can, and to lead in this battle of our kind of ideas, as I put it, like on the ground, and come up with alternatives that's so irresistible that when we then go back, in a year or 2 years' time with a couple of things that are bubbling now, there'll be so much of a base and so much of a proven track record that even they will have to, at least put some sound arguments as to why they want to oppose something which is improving the quality of life of several communities here in our city. So those are some things I think we need to talk about, because when the congressman was talking about needing help, I'm all for that. Let me be clear. But I think how we build our social movements and how we need to gain strength, build the strength of the social movements, to me is still a priority. Because I think, look, if we just look at what many view as a historic verdict, what happened yesterday, let's be mindful that that was only rendered because of the strength of the social movement that we saw all of last summer. Millions of people, and I mean millions of people, being out in the street demanding some form of justice, some form of accountability, and really pressing the system to its limits. That is what it's going to take on all the various issues that are confronting us, that we have to build that level of strength. Now, in terms of ideas, because I know I'm running out of time, there's a couple of things that we want to really see put out there. There's a formula that we've been trying to popularize now for about a year called the Build and Fight formula. And there's a couple of critical sections that we think where we need to build some strong connective tissue here in the United States between the social movements that are engaged in new forms of productive activities. And from our perspective, like with the Next System project, when we step back at just Cooperation Jackson, particularly looking at things that have happened since COVID-19, one of the things, the pandemic, one of the things that really stuck out was, last year at this time, there were hundreds of thousands of very autonomous, very spontaneous mutual aid efforts that just popped up all throughout the country. And from my vantage point, that was a beautiful thing to see. It really was some of what I talked about, the neoliberal project and how it tried to destroy communities and leave us with Margaret Thatcher, that there is no alternative to, the cold variant of capitalism that they are preaching and promoting and ramming down our throats. This was an expression that hasn't taken total hold and control, and that people, even in the midst of a pandemic, wanted to connect, saw the need to connect, and then took proactive steps to do it. And so from that, we started just really trying to come up with analysis that if there's millions of people already engaged in this, which is what that amounted to, how can it be sustained? And how could it lead to the development, where people are already at, what they're already practicing, how could it lead to broader transformation? And that's what this formula came up with. And some of the things that we identified in short that we want to promote, that we need to continue the broad practices of mutual aid, not only in times of crisis, immediate crisis, as people would say it, like with the pandemic. But I think what the pandemic really demonstrated, even though there were millions of people who got immediately kind of put out of work, as we know in our community, long before the pandemic, there was a major economic crisis already afoot, and there were millions of people, whose caloric intakes are not being met, who are struggling to pay the rent. And that we need to build up the systems and reserves to be able to kind of confront that. So keeping that and trying to extend that, but it has to be connected with our productive activities, right? And this is where we think the work that many people are doing, that people kind of think of as small scale, with the community gardens, right? The urban farming. Let's imagine scaling that up and directly connecting it to the mutual aid efforts, and tying those in so that the mutual aid effort is not just totally dependent upon, folks making donations or just donating food, but that we are producing food that directly can serve the needs of those. So it's a production for need, right? Not just a production for profit, but a production for need that can be scaled up by people engaging in these mutual activities. And if we combine that with the growing kind of cooperative movement in this country, and the movement, for worker self-management, we then tie in another deeper level of productive activity and transformation, really extending out all the aspects of economic democracy that many of us, are working so hard to try to build and try to instill in folks' heads, but to connect these different pieces, because people are already engaged. There's already a movement doing all of these things. I think the challenge for us is, right, both intellectually and in the concrete, how do we link all these different things together? First in our neighborhoods, then within the municipality, then within the state, but then we have to figure out how do we build the connective webs, right, where we are creating our own value and supply chains within this network to create the concrete alternative that we need to really usher in a new system, the next system that we're going to need to overcome the systemic challenges that we're being confronted with. These are the concrete things that we think we could do. It's easier said than done. Building a co-op is not the easiest thing in the world. Let me just put that out to folks. And we have to deal with, all the things that we've been socialized. None of us have been, we say around here, a phrase that we stole from many others, none of us have been schooled in democracy, right? That's not what we've been socialized into. So we have to learn how to do that. And that comes with a lot of drama, a lot of conflict, but we have to, rely upon the tools that are being developed to mediate against that, right? And to build healthy, non-toxic cultures. And that's work within itself. But it's work that we have to do, because there's a lot of regenerative work that's going to take place, to really create the next system. Because it's not just like, look, even on the environmental front, that we just start, even if we were to stop all the oiling and the drilling right now, we still have a lot of work to do to create new systems of production that put them in the state that they're in, and think that we can continue extracting from them in new ways or with new technology, and just keep the system of consumption on a mass scale and waste on a mass scale that we are presently using on the whole globally. Like that wouldn't resolve this crisis, right? There's some deep regenerative work that we have to do. And that healing work of building kind of the mutual aid, building the food sovereignty work, and building the cooperative work, I think are key components of that. And if there's two components, I would ask, those of you who are academics to really help hone in on. One is, looking at how do we craft new kind of commons-based policy here in the United States, right? And then how can that be buttressed with new land relationships, starting with community land trusts, but also going into deeper practices of decolonizing the land and returning it back to indigenous sovereignty, but in us being in direct productive relationship with that on new grounds. So some intellectual work, some exploration that needs to happen there that I want to put out to folks to challenge them. And with that, I can go on for a long time, but I'll stop just in the interest of time and want to hear others and learn more myself. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was exactly where we needed to go, I think, and I hope, and I'm sure that students who are here, as well as my colleagues, we're hearing lots of challenges, economic challenges, design challenges, political challenges, cultural challenges that you're grappling with. And I'd say there's a bit of propaganda of the deed in the way that we've set up this conversation today. We're starting with the practitioners, the folks who are both thinking and doing and learning from the experience, because that's the way in which next system studies in the academy is going to start out and continue. So we definitely will have you back anytime that you're able to join us. I just want to say that right now, and thank you. Next, I will turn it over to Gar Alperovitz, who is, among other things, co-founder of the Next System Project and the Democracy Collaborative. Gar, please take it away.
Always forget to unmute. So good to be with you, and good to be with Kali as well. Good friends, one and all. I think the first thing to say is this idea of the next system, or what does that mean? What we're really talking about is that the state socialist systems like the Soviet Union didn't work for a variety of reasons. But corporate capitalism, the kind that we live in, I'm from Wisconsin, and in Racine, Wisconsin, grew up in that time, was based on a model in which corporations were counterbalanced politically as well as economically by labor unions. The so-called welfare state was built that way. And labor unions in Sweden were 80% of the labor force. They never got anywhere beyond 30%, 34% in the United States. And the system was a sort of balance between labor and capital, and the politics flowed from that. I'm obviously oversimplifying, but those were the key ingredients of the systemic design, corporate capitalism, balanced by labor, but also balanced politically with labor union money and organizing. That design is over. That system is over. Labor unions are now down to 6% of the labor force in the private sector, just about 10% if you include the teachers and public sector, and declining. By way of comparison, they were 85% in Sweden, the so-called welfare state model. If you think about that, the corporate power side of this is overwhelmingly dominant, not only economically, but politically. That is a systemic design that has radically shifted away from the old welfare state model that I grew up with in Wisconsin and worked in the politics. It isn't there anymore, and it's getting worse. Mr. Trump flowed from that model and from that decay and from the pain that it left in its wake in Black, Hispanic, and white working class communities. Now, it's one thing to say we need a movement, which I agree, and we need a new politics, which I agree, but what the systemic challenge is, we need an institutional foundations for that new politics to get beyond token achievements. That's what it means to talk about systems. It means also, as in the building of the labor movements, it means 10 to 20 to 30 years of development, even as you try to hold the line with current politics. I am not against current politics. You've got to do what you can. You've got to do what you can at the local level, national, state level, the best you can to hold the line and achieve gains. But long haul, you've got to change the institutional power structure. And the most important piece of that in virtually all of the advanced capitalist countries for progressives has been labor unions as the basis of a progressive politics as well as economics. And labor unions are gone, all but gone. They are, Sweden, it was 85%, we're down to 6% of the labor force. We never got more than 34%. We were always a weak welfare state capitalist system. And that is decaying down to 6% and going further down, so that the institutions of this system, sort of a weak welfare state corporate capitalism, are now way overbalanced economically. And now partly as a result of that, the pain levels increasing in the white working class and others have funded and fueled the basis of a man like Trump, and worse. That's a systemic crisis, not simply a political crisis. The institutions are decaying, not just the politics. That's what we mean by systemic crisis. So that's the premise. I'm obviously shortening and foreshortening it far too greatly. But that is different from just a political crisis. It means the underlying institutional power base, particularly to oversimplify labor unions in all of the capitalist countries, is just about gone. And I'm a great supporter of labor unions, both politically and economically, but it's going down to 6%, and now in the private sector, if you throw in the teachers and a few public sectors, 10.5 to 11, and declining against corporate power. It's not 85% as in Sweden. That's crisis. And the numbers that show up in as you look, the numbers reflect that. I'll throw a few at you. We now rank 21st out of 21 in connection with inequality worldwide. We are 21st out of 21 in poverty. Life expectancy, 21st out of 21. Infant mortality, 21st out of 21. Mental health, 18th out of 20. Obesity, 18th out of 18. 19th out of 21 programs, social programs as a percentage of GDP, 19th out of 21. Maternity leave, 21st out of 21. Paid annual leave, 20th out of 20. Material well-being of children, 19th out of 21. Overall environmental performance, 21st out of 21. That is a system-wide crisis, not simply a political problem. Let me say that again. That's a system-wide crisis, not simply a political problem, though it obviously is also a political problem. If you say that much, then the next question becomes, how do you change the system if the system is producing those outcomes? And the classical models are reform, labor movement, social democracy, strong liberalism, Scandinavian model. Bernie talks that way, but the labor union base is gone over time. The other model was revolution, overthrow the state. That's a highly unlikely and probably very dangerous and an ugly option. The model that slowly is beginning to emerge, and we could go into some depth if we have time, and Kali was talking about it, is the slow rebuilding of new institutions from the bottom up to build a new base for politics. That's one piece. And we're seeing a lot of that. And we're seeing the development of worker cooperatives. We're seeing complex, in Cleveland, for instance, there's a complex system of several hundred workers in cooperative organizations linked together as a community-wide organization. So it's a community structure and community worker-owned companies building a new institutional base for politics, replacing or transcending the labor union institutional base for progressive politics. There are many cities, Preston in England, where we've worked the same community-wide, but ownership of capital, not just cooperatives, but large scale, 400 or 500 people involved in the structures, building new power. And some of the universities, for instance, and hospitals buying from them to sustain a new model that is community, worker, cooperative, but also integrated and linked to higher order strategies. We had the Great Recession, we had a massive crisis. We nationalized General Motors, Chrysler Corporation, AIG, the largest insurance company in the world. Most people don't know insurance companies are big banks. They're much more important as financial institutions than they are as insurance companies. We nationalized them because there are recurrent crises at the national level that don't end up in a revolution, but they do end up in the institutional change often, and likely in future, because labor is so weak and because the politics of the progressives, traditional progressives, out of which I come and Ben comes, that's weakening, we're likely to see micro crises like the Great Recession. But with them, nationalizations, and maybe Chrysler and General Motors were nationalized. AIG was nationalized, and only 10 years later given back. So we're seeing a different form of change, and that change begins to build from community and community/worker ownership and cooperative ownership and neighborhood ownership, many models. So we're going to talk about the next system book that Ben might mention. I know it's being used in his course, which has much more information on all the stuff that's not covered by the press, building up, as Kali was talking about, from the bottom up. But also nationally, we've seen recurrent, regular crises where big change occurs, but there's no follow-up. We poured a huge amount of money into Chrysler and General Motors and AIG, this big insurance conglomerate, and then it was given over back to them. A movement is simultaneously building. So what you can think of as in the future is the rebuilding from the communities up, and that's happening in many parts of the country. That we can provide much. You've talked about the new system reader that's just been issued by Gus Speth, a member of our Democracy Collaborative, just covers the waterfront on that. Or if you go to the Democracy Collaborative webpage, you find lots and lots of detail on all this. Building from the ground up in many parts of the country, not covered by the press, but also recurrent mini or meta crises at the national level, not revolutionary, but they offer opportunities for big change regularly throughout the 20th century. It's not the first time that there have been takeovers. And we see that kind of development as increasingly likely, primarily because reform liberalism, out of which I come, is so weak in the United States. 6% of the labor force backing the liberal politics. So we see micro crises building up and opening opportunities for big change at the national level, which a movement can build and support, and the growing movement supports. And the third piece is regional structure. The United States is a gigantic country. You can tuck Germany into Montana. You can chuck France into Texas. the economy of California is the 5th or 6th largest in the world, depending upon when you measure it. So we expect there will be more regional decentralization over time, with things as in California take over big banks, the development of these models from the ground up in regions. So the prospect is, in our view, is systemic change, not simply by the traditional models of reform, which is just organizing politics to get a new law passed to make something better happen, and not by revolution where everything explodes and change, but what I've come to call evolutionary reconstruction, building from the bottom up new institutions like worker-owned companies and cooperatives. And the Cleveland model is the most advanced in this country, with 400 or 500 people under new community cooperative structures, and purchasing power from universities and hospitals so they have a guaranteed market, but also mini crises like General Motors, like the Great Recession. A very complex process of changing the system, changing the systemic design from the ground up, from mini crises, from decentralization to big states like that are equal of regions, Texas, California, New England. We see a process of that kind offering the basis of building actually a transcendent movement over time. I think it is practical. The press doesn't cover what's going on at the local level in any parts of the country in any depth. But if you have access to the kind of information that's available, and you can go to the website of the Next System Project or the Democracy Collaborative, where we have access to, there's a huge amount of stuff going on in terms of worker ownership, community ownership, city ownership, land ownership, municipal ownership, takeovers at the local and state level, which is laying groundwork, as Kali was talking about. But also, if you link that with the mini crises that are recurrent and likely to recur more, primarily because the politics is not supporting a strong regulatory regime, we see an evolving reconstructive process rather than a revolutionary or reform process, opening a way to a vision that is kind of like the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is a big regional public enterprise combined with local cooperatives, worker ownership, slowly evolving as the movement of this kind builds and is building on. The last thing I'd say, don't trust me if I say that, because I often repeat myself and say more than one last thing. The press just doesn't cover what's going on at the grassroots level in this country, or most countries, to be quite honest. But if you look closely at it, and if you go to the webpage of the Next System Project of the Democracy Collaborative, there's an enormous amount of experimentation with worker, community, neighborhood ownership, developing the new institutions, just as in the 10 to 20 years before the New Deal, labor unions came into a great strength and they came into their own during the 1930s. We see that process building up just below the surface, more and more people becoming aware of it, and a lot of activity that I think points in the direction of quite a new model. I guess the final thing to say is that technology is so powerful now. It is that with the modern technology, we could be seeing in the next 10 to 20 to 30 years, average family income in the 100 to 125,000 for families of 4 would be possible with the economic power we already are generating, if we could achieve an egalitarian politics to reorganize the distribution of that wealth. The country is very rich and the technology is very powerful if we can build community and democratic politics and institutions to grasp that and use it in a different way.
Thank you, Gar. Thank you so much. And we heard some more challenges there at the end, the challenges of systemic design. How do we do it? Challenges around systemic movements. How do we build the capacity, and where do we recognize that capacity is growing? And also questions around system change. How does it happen in this model of reconstruction as another alternative that is emergent? I really want to thank you, Gar, and I just want to say that I'm going to pull up a slide here just for those who missed it earlier to show that in this course we are using the new systems reader. I know that Gus Speth will be on the line to me if I didn't show this again. And also another required reading for the course is Collective Courage by Jessica Nemhart on the history of the Black cooperative movement in America. We'll be bringing in many other resources as well as we build this case, including America Beyond Capitalism and other things that we have to use from the practice of community-based and sort of national projects like the Next System Project and Democracy Collaborative. So thanks for all the work that makes this possible at my end, and I'm looking forward to future collaborations. I'm going to now turn to Mike Strode, the Cola Nut Collaborative in Chicago, what I jokingly call Greater Wisconsin, although really Wisconsin is part of the Chicago economic region. Mike, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Ben. Yes, I've certainly seen that, there was an article sometime back that called, Racine like they were looking at like this Chicago as the mega city, right? And it extended out to Racine. But setting that aside, yes, I am Mike Strode here with the Cola Nut Collaborative, Southeast Chicago, but also representing as a board member of the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network. So, forgive me if I'm an inadequate stand-in for Emily Kawano, but, I'll try. And in terms of, the things that I am looking at related to sort of the academy and the transition. So the work that I do in the Cola Nut Collaborative is intensely local. I'm deeply committed to, the local character, the local cohesion of the city, neighbor organizing, network weaving that happens on the city level. And the work that I do in the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network is a little bit larger in scope. So it requires me to kind of, go national and think about how that network weaving scales up to regional and national context. And so, the primary projects that I'm doing locally are really around facilitation and around the development of group dynamics and group cohesion, and some of those things. And the work that I do in the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network with initiatives such as the Quarterly Resist and Build Summit are, again, really about taking folks who are activated on the local level, who are activated on the regional level, and beginning to do some of that network weaving and that facilitation in that larger national context. And so a few of the things that I wanted to dive into with regard to my relationship with the Academy and my thoughts in terms of, how it relates to the movement work that I do on that sort of local and national level, really began first with an article that I read back in the winter of 2020 by Daryl Holliday of City Bureau. So for those who are unfamiliar with City Bureau, it has a documenters program which effectively sends community or trains community members in news reporting practices, and then sends them out to public meetings, and basically, just documents public meetings that are covered by traditional outlets, and just and invisible oftentimes to the broader community. So effectively, it has this deep commitment to expanding the sort of civic participation by not only giving these practices of journalism to community members to use as they will to kind of to help better inform their own communities, but also to make visible some of this sort of invisible architecture that happens in political space. But the reason that I'm kind of highlighting City Bureau and highlighting this article that I read from Daryl Holliday, because the article talked about what journalism can learn from mutual aid, and it was really Daryl's reflection on this notion of movement journalism, which is the recognition that journalism for a long time has specifically served certain communities and has disserved other communities. And so I just kind of want to highlight a line at the end of that article where Daryl talks about a healthy and democratic future demands that the skills journalists possess be distributed among many, not bestowed on a select few. The journalists we need today are not heroic observers of crises. They are conveners, facilitators, organizers, educators, on-demand investigators, and community builders. Most of all, they strengthen the systems that make communities resilient. So, in terms of the ways that I think about the sort of the academic work and how the interaction happens between the academy and movement building, it's really about that level of sort of interdisciplinary awareness, the recognition that the skills that you possess are not your individual skills alone. They are to be put at service of the work of changing and transforming the world. And, those are things that I certainly see that City Bureau does, not only by, training community members in the skills that they might need to better cover their own communities, but also by the type of journalism that they bring, because they also, have their own stories that they're covering, on a regular basis. And, I just got a note today in my email, who is the voice of Adam Toledo? Adam Toledo is someone who was killed by police here in Chicago, and on the sort of eve of this current, this current space that we are in. So, when I think of when I think of, what the relationship is between movement and academy, I'm thinking, of the ways that journalism itself, whether it's the City Bureau example, or whether it's the New Economies Reporting Project, the Media Consortium and Laura Flanders, all of those initiatives that talk about the fact that the work that we are doing is to be at the service of this project, this larger project of transforming and changing the world. And from there, I'll pivot to another example, when I want to kind of reflect on movement scholarship. So back in 2009, I helped to establish something called the Healthy Food Hub with Black Oak Center for Sustainable Renewable Living, Barbara Fred Carter, Dr. Jafunza Wright Carter. And this is a food sovereignty initiative which connects Black farmers in the historically Black farming community of Pembroke Township near Kankakee with food insecure communities on the west and south sides of Chicago. And the goal was really, in the ways that we think about sort of the natural cooperation that happens when you have two ends of the pipeline, which both have unmet needs. Farmers who do not have necessarily robust routes to market, because the only route that you have in a city like Chicago is either you are serving some large food system provider like Cisco, or you are trucking your stuff into a farmer's market where you might lose half of the take that you bring in. So how do you actually begin to build systems that would serve the goal of food sovereignty? The goal is not simply for us to kind of pivot and be able to serve more food into the sort of capitalist context that has warehouses and has large stores, but it's how can communities develop and design food systems that truly meet their needs in the most robust way. And so the Healthy Food Hub was this experiment that we launched in order to do that. And so in developing that space of the Healthy Food Hub, we had a common colleague and comrade of many in this space, Melissa Figueroa, showed up one day at the Healthy Food Hub and said, hey, I want to learn about this space. Or is there something I can do? Is there some work that I can do inside of this space? And spent a year, really working with us on different systems and the market days that we had and in service of our membership. And basically was hands-on and embedded in this project for the course of that year. Now, she did make clear to us that there was also some academic research that was happening here, and later it was only later on that after well after sort of that year that I received this paper, Globalizations, that she had written, which really talked about sort of talked about food sovereignty and spoke specifically about the Healthy Food Hub as a food sovereignty initiative, and really, contextualize it both as its own activity, as this activity that we were doing to kind of create this liberated zone around food, but also talked about the sort of history of food sovereignty and situated us within the history. And clearly it was one of the first experiences that I'd had, where some work that I was doing was presented in that way and offered, me a little bit of context, a little bit of analysis that expanded the dimensions of how I thought about the work. So it was a really important piece of movement scholarship that I had the opportunity to experience. And for me, when I think about a movement scholar, when I think about movement scholarship, I always veer to that example, because for me, that's someone who is putting the academics not simply at the work of further knowledge creation and theory, but they're putting their scholarship at the work of communities who are trying to figure out problems and trying to understand how the solutions they are designing connect to other spaces that maybe they don't see. We didn't have a lot of time to kind of bring our head above water to, you know, be able to do a lot of the research around these other models. And so the work that Melissa did was critically important for us to kind of, you know, begin to see ourselves as part of that larger scope. Next, I'll pivot to another, you know, a movement scholar who's already been mentioned, you know, as one of the texts for this course. So Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nimhard in Collective Courage, and the experience that I had in 2015 when the text is released, where, you know, many of us, you know, in Black communities were grappling, you know, with this notion of like, what does it mean to be in cooperation? What does it mean to develop cooperatives, you know, and didn't necessarily have a cohesive vision of that history. And the Collective Courage text, you know, I mean, I certainly recognize it as the movement, as the book that stirred, you know, 1,000 study groups, right? Because, you know, I mean, some of them kind of spun up and then spun down, but some of them, like Cooperation for Liberation Study and Working Group here in Chicago, of which I'm a member, which is really focused on attempting to provide a community-centered, culturally relevant education on worker cooperatives for Black communities. Inspired by the text of Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nimhard. So taking something that's a really robust piece of scholarship that sometimes can be very dense, that is, you know, has a lot of facts and has a lot of elements that might be hard to access. But then we are taking that text and we are saying, how can we break this text down into, you know, teaching modules of our own? You know, I mean, community facilitated teaching modules that anyone can access and anyone can facilitate. But also, you know, designing other types of materials, you know, videos and interviews and zines, those sorts of things. But Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nimhard did not simply release that text and then, you know, I mean, go back to the sort of, you know, academic cave. She is a movement educator, right? She is embedded in this work, and she is out there kind of pushing this knowledge forward and encouraging us not simply to read the text and sit it down, but to read the text and understand how we build the future and how we shape and mold the future from this the scholarship that's been put forward here. And so I see that as the sort of, you know, we've got sort of the movement journalism aspect, we've got the movement scholarship aspect, we've got movement educator and movement research dimensions that that Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nimhard provides for, you know, for me in terms of, you know, the approach to how she puts forward that work. So in reviewing some of the materials that were put forward for reading, the community engaged civic research, I've already talked about the idea of this embodied movement scholarship. These are things that I am very excited to see, because ultimately, you know, too often, and you know, and I certainly have lots of friends who are academics. Too often, the sort of the way that we approach sort of the academy and the way we approach academics, if you're going to go into knowledge creation, if you're going to go into sort of, you know, the higher ethos of higher education, you are divorced from the community for 6 years, right? And when you come back, you have very little context for what else is happening here. And so, is there a way that we can do scholarship differently, where we can ensure that it's about being embedded in the community, and it's about being embedded in the activities that are attempting to transform and to change conditions, to change the world, this activity of world making that is connected to this process of knowledge creation, that is connected to all of these other things that we are thinking through and doing. So it is, you know, truly, to Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, the only reason that we gain knowledge is so that we can change the world. The only reason that we have this process of kind of thinking and reflecting on these things is so that we can go out and move something so that it is more just and it is more equitable on the other side of whatever it is that we're thinking about. So with that, you know, I think that's sort of my concluding point, and thank you very much.
Well, Mike, my brain is buzzing right now. There was so much there, and really wonderful that you were able to make this work and join us for this session today. And I want to say that in terms of the commitments of this program and this department at Mason to community engaged research, there are actually a number of research hubs and projects that are engaged with communities that we'll hear a little bit more about. And one of those is also a movement engaged research hub. So I'm seeing lots of possibilities for continuing the work at my end with you and with others here tonight. And I also appreciated hearing about Mel Figueroa's work with you, because I hadn't known about that. I knew her from other contexts. She's a geographer, UCal Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, who is really quite brilliant. And I recommend her work to everybody here. So, but Mike, thank you for your brilliance as well today and tonight, and really appreciate it. Look forward to the discussion. Our final major panelist here is also somebody who I mentioned we're quite lucky to have with us today. Peter Knowlton, just retired a few years ago from the General Presidency of the United Electrical Workers, my favorite union here in the United States. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you. Mine too. My favorite union as well. So I want to thank Ben and thank the Social Science Research Center for putting this together. I think this is a really good discussion. I've learned a ton during it. Looking forward to the reaction from some of the academics and for all the work that we will be doing collectively together as we move forward. First, a shout out to Roberto and Warehouse Workers for Justice, who was a UE-inspired project a decade ago in the Chicago Joliet area, has been doing some really transformational work in organizing, specifically in the warehouse industry, have been on the leading edge of doing a lot of really good cutting edge work. And also, in addition to that, they just elected to the Joliet City Council the first Latino to the Joliet City Council yesterday, Cesar Guerrero, who's also the youngest member ever to be elected to the Joliet City Council. And that's part of their work in drawing the connections between building politics between not just the shop, but also to the community, and being able to reinforce some very good progressive politics in the community that help the community and also help workers to protect and defend themselves in the workplace, in the warehouse industry in Joliet. Some very good work. And a shout out to the United Mine Workers of America, who just began to embrace Biden's infrastructure plan and acknowledged that their industry is in severe decline and that they need to do everything about it, not just to keep it going, but to re-engineer and to redesign new systems of work in West Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and elsewhere. And it's really a good development with them embracing the industrial plan and embracing this new economy on a renewable level that we're trying to build in this country and around the world. So that was also a very good development. I also want to highlight, before I begin, something that Gar raised, which is, and I'll come at it a little different way, which is 94% of private sector workers have no organization in the shop. Or if they do, it's an indigenous organization, but probably does not include a collective agreement, and probably not with the same strength as a quote unquote traditional union does. And that also means that 90% of all workers, public and private sector, don't have any organization in the shop. And that is a relic from our perspective in the UE from something that actually began in the 40s and in the 50s with McCarthy era, where the deal was cut really where trade unions would deal with what was within the four walls of a factory, and capital and the politicians and employers would deal with everything else outside the factory. And that basically labor would follow the coattails of business along political lines. And that has continued on for decades up until today. And it is a legacy that we're left with. It is a legacy that we have to get out of and build something new. Unions, frankly, if we don't have a robust and a strong union movement within the workplaces in the states, we can't democratize work. It's just simply not possible. And I'll talk about it as I go along, but simply having a co-op structure doesn't work. If workers are not represented and have a strong militant union in the workplace, they simply don't have the voice and they're not able to really level the playing ground. And it provides a level playing field. And it's why, as part of this discussion, people should recognize that the PRO Act, as much of a piece of reform legislation it is, how incredibly important it is to the future of the labor movement and of building worker organizations in the country. Now, that's not to take away from all the hundreds of organizing that is going on around the country today without the National Labor Relations Board, without any federal legislation, and are just doing it by the sweat of their brow and their own force on the workplace and being able to force changes, both to protect the workers in the shop, but also to defend their members and to build a better community that they live in. But it's also why union renewal to a more militant rank and file class-based unionism has to be on the table. And I equate it similar to what happened when the CIO was built in 1935 in response to the inadequacies posed by craft unionism and the AFL during that period of time. And we have to do a similar sort of things in building a new class-based unionism, but probably in some ways a much more substantive and substantial form of unionism that will embrace many more people than was even done by the CIO in the 30s. Labor creates all wealth. It always has and it always will. It's just as true today as it was yesterday or in the 1800s or the 1700s. But the problem is workers get very little benefit from the wealth that we create. Around 10 to 15% of manufacturing costs are what it costs for a unit of labor within manufacturing with many other enterprises. At most, it'd be around 20%. So it's a very small part of the gross profit of an industry. And yet they act as if the wages that they have to pay us and the benefits that they have to give us put them into bankruptcy. And they use it, have always used it historically as the reason for offshoring, going overseas, or before that, going down south, is that they had to go to non-union cheap labor. But much of these costs are inflated. Health insurance are privatized. All sorts of benefit structures are privatized. They're not publicized, they're not socialized, they're all privatized, which drives up the cost that not only workers, but employers have to bear. Wages have historically been higher in the United States than in many other countries, although that's not as true now as it used to be. And a lot of it is because of the lack of socialized benefits mandated by the state that most other countries enjoy, including a country to the north of us who has universal health care, and countries to the south of us, east and west of us. But as the spouse of someone who comes from the Azores, which is a province of Portugal in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, over the last, and we go back and forth, and I've been doing it for the last 25 years, and we did it during NAFTA. They had the European Union to lift up the working class and the poorest of the poor in those European countries, which was specifically Portugal and Spain. And watching as we come back home, as plants were closing as a result of NAFTA, which was our greatest race to the bottom. But when you go to other countries, in particular Europe and Latin America and Southeast Asia and Africa, other countries where workers have a better way of life because the benefits have been socialized and they don't make as much money as we do. In Portugal, they make about 2/3 to half of what most workers in the US make. But their way of life is far superior to what we have here, because they're guaranteed 4 weeks vacation. They're guaranteed maternity and paternity leave. They're guaranteed health insurance. They work a shorter work week. All of those socialized benefits contribute to the improving the lifestyle of workers in those countries. And they also have much more robust trade unions. They may not represent a greater percentage of workers as a form in terms of membership, but their political influence and the structural and legal mechanisms that exist in the country give workers much more power and much more respect and dignity than we do in this country. So strong unions are key to any democratizing of any system that we're going to do. And worker ownership and control is not pie in the sky. There's plenty of examples around the United States. I'm not going to go through a list. Folks have already been talking about some. The work that they're doing in Jackson is really on the front line of a lot of the work dealing with more cooperative enterprises and cooperative structures. But there's other places as well. I lived in Minneapolis for 7 years, and Minneapolis would claim to be the center of cooperative movements, although Madison might have a beef with it. But when I was there, and there was all sorts of cooperatives that were built, everything from warehouses to restaurants to bicycle shops to health care centers. And it's been a tradition in the Midwest for many years. As people know, the banks in North Dakota are owned by the state. The state of South Dakota had a cement plant for many years outside of Rapid City. So it's not unusual for us in this country to have examples of either public or cooperative ownership. And that's important for us to recognize. But the problem is now in particular is that US workers are infused with the idea of just being told what to do. It is still very much of a master-servant relationship within the workforce. And the unions begin to level that out to some degree, but they don't in any way, shape, or form do away with that relationship. And right now, most workers don't believe that they have the capacity to run an enterprise. I've been through, and the mind shift only happens when making these projects happen and building on each effort, successful or not, that we learn from each successful effort, how to begin to change that mentality and the way that workers view their relationship with their employer and their relationship with work. I can just give you a few examples. We have many times, I started working with the UE in the early 80s, probably for the first 10 to 15 years of my work with the union. I negotiated more plant closing agreements than I did collective agreements. And it was when there was huge deindustrialization going in this country, probably one of the most unjust transitions this country ever saw. Corporations were milking profits out of manufacturing, and we represented tens of thousands of workers in the machine tool industry, General Electric warehouse, all sorts of Allen Bradley in Chicago, lots of places around the country. Deindustrialization happened at a relatively quick pace. We only got 60 days notice because of the Workers' Assistance Relocation Notice Act for most events. And within that 60-day period, we had to come up with a plan to how to save the jobs that our members used to do, not only legally, organizationally, and politically, but how are we going to provide a future? How are our members going to provide a future for themselves in that facility or that enterprise? So oftentimes, we look to worker-owned and operated cooperative structures, but there were such huge roadblocks in front of us, both financially and organizationally and expertise-wise, that in almost every single case, it became nigh into impossible to be able to pull off. And in particular, there are things like the financing is just one aspect of it, which is a huge issue. But there's other issues like engineers, like salespeople, where our members don't necessarily have those skills, and the people that are in those positions, when it is a capitalist enterprise, aren't necessarily on our side and aren't necessarily supportive of our goals of building a different form of structure and a more collectivized structure of worker empowerment. So it became very difficult when we would set out on a project to, number one, potentially take a factory by eminent domain, and then secondly, try to set up a structure where the workers owned the facility and ran the facility. There are key components, day-to-day components that we did not have access to because there's really no structure or resources in the country to be able to help us in these kind of situations. There used to be a National Consumer Co-op Bank, which theoretically was set up under Carter to help cooperatives. But the problem is they would help REI, but they would not help us when I drove for Yellow Cab in 1980 when we tried to buy the company when Checker Motors was going to shut it down. There was no resources for us to tap into to be able to buy a company for $2.5 million. We didn't have the resources ourselves to do it. We ended up getting some loans from the bank, but the National Consumer Co-op Bank, which was set up specifically to help co-ops, wouldn't give us the $400,000 last piece that we needed because we had a union, and we had a strong union. And the loan officer specifically asked us, if we told you in order to get this loan, you had to do away with the union, how would you react? And since the executive board of the local was also the executive board of the co-op, we told them to go pound sand. We weren't going to enter into that kind of an agreement. But there is not the resources, and workers and unions don't have the resources. This is a federal and a state responsibility from our perspective. In order for us to be able to build these new structures in a robust and a competent way, in a substantial way that breeds success, we need the resources and the massive resources of the federal government, federal assistance, and state assistance, as well as university and academic assistance in order to help us. There's also public employment in other sectors of the economy that we don't necessarily see a lot in the US, but which is what we all need to talk about. Because public sector employment is very strong and it's consistent, and it provides resources from the state and federal government in order to do certain things that aren't for a profit and are for the people. The issue is in our country, though, is that we've been brainwashed to thinking that if it's owned by the public sector, it's bad, that it's inefficient, that it's not good. But I will tell you from my own experience being a union rep in factory for over nearly 4 decades is, if you want to see one of the most inefficient modes of production, go work in a factory. in a capitalist system. It is not a very efficient way of producing products. So we have public sector, and we can do this in the energy, especially around the issue of climate change. Trade unions for energy democracy are talking about this a lot, about the need to publicize our energy systems in the US. Transportation, manufacturing, banking, we all have examples of things that can be done. There's a UE-inspired project in Chicago, Local 1110, that used to be called Republic Windows and Doors. People may remember this because of the occupation of the factory that the workers did for a week back in 2008 that got support from Obama just after his election. And it was receiving a lot of national publicity. That is now called New Era Windows and Doors in Chicago, and is a worker-owned and operated cooperative. But it struggles, and it struggles for the reason that I said around issues of engineering, sales, the additional financial support that any other capitalist would get. And yet, because it's a worker-owned and operated cooperative, they don't get the same kind of information, the same kind of support that they need. We have to just be very clear that with co-ops, it's very important for us to build producer, consumer, worker-owned and operated co-ops. But even in a worker-owned cooperative, if you don't have a strong union, you're not going to be able to democratize the workplace to the degree that is necessary. And that's a critical piece that I think people need to understand, in particular in consumer co-ops and in producer co-ops as well. We represent a bunch of consumer co-ops around the country. In every single one, management in a consumer co-op is as bad, if not worse, than General Electric or Westinghouse or RCA or Sylvania, any of the major capitalist producers. They have the same mindset. They have the same way of going about of the relationship of master-servant relationship. And they won't give their workers the ability to be on a level playing field and to be able to improve their working conditions and improve how the product is done. But our locals do a really good job in enforcing certain standards to make sure that the employers toe the line. I'm running out of time. I don't want to take up any more time. This is a very good discussion. I just want you all to know this is an excellent discussion. This is where the trade union movement needs to be in the middle of this discussion, like it does at climate change, because as we always say, if we're not at the table, we're going to be on the menu. So I want to thank everybody very much. It's a very good session.
Thank you so much, Peter. And you just made it even a better session with your contributions, and I think gave all of us a lot to think about. I was reminded of my years driving for a union cab co-op in Madison, union, both unionized and a worker-owned cooperative. That made a big difference for me at a critical time in my life, and it's still going strong. I'm also reminded in terms of Wisconsin of how about 10 years ago, the GM plant shut down in my wife's hometown of Janesville. Most of her family were employed there at one point, UAW represented. And then, of course, the talk of a worker buyout and turning it over didn't get anywhere, but the state gave a $4.5 billion subsidy to Foxconn, a transnational corporation out of Taiwan instead. So we can see priorities. Union Cab started in the late 70s out of a union strike and then got state support. That made a difference. It's been lasting in the Madison area. But when you have higher level authorities, state authorities in this case, that are not about next system projects, you can see what happens to communities. Janesville with massive unemployment and repercussions still from that. So thank you. A lot, as you can see, that got a lot going for me. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing from our two, and there are many other people we could have had here, but there's a reason why we have Diane Fujino and Amy Best here to respond as academics, as scholar activists based in the academy. And I really want to thank you, Dr. Diane Fujino, for joining us tonight, and looking forward to hearing your reflections on what has come so far.
Thank you, Ben, so much for the invitation. And I speak here from the Chumash lands and waters of Santa Barbara, California. And this is the place where the Union oil spill inspired the first Earth Day, right in 1970. Amy Best and I are here as academic respondents, and we're asked to offer reflections on the panelists' statements, as well as some of our own observations, and then to raise questions. And I want to say that this incredibly important panel of speakers and longtime organizers are stressing the urgency of our times, right? We are at a critical crossroads, and I would say arguably the most important crossroads in my lifetime, right? As we return from COVID shutdown, are we going to return to quote unquote normal? Or are we going to be able to intervene in this great uncertainty and in this unsettledness of the moment to create a more liberatory and equitable society? And I'm concerned. I'm energized by the work that we're hearing about on this panel and things happening all over the world and throughout the nation. But I'm also concerned because I see the forces at work already trying to co-opt the kinds of ideas where people are now talking about anti-racism and justice, but they really are, right, in the guise of reformist reforms that don't do the work that the Next Systems is trying to do, that all the panelists here are talking about to really transform society. So I think that all the panelists are really grappling with this question of how we create fundamental change in society and recognizing that small incremental change will not bring the justice that we seek, and that we really need to be addressing systems of racial, gendered capitalism, colonialism, white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, environmental catastrophe, and all of these kinds of problems. And the question is, right, I think the question is that I'm understanding Next Systems is asking is, what will the next systems be, right? How can we bring our radical imaginations and our strategizing and organizing skills to build something different that's truly meaningful and truly liberatory? And I think a crucial question that our panelists are asking is, how can we collectively build a new system? And I want to point out three things that I'm hearing coming out of the speakers. There's so much more, but I'm just going to point out three things or else I'll be here forever, right? One is because this is talking about next systems in the academy, right? People are asking about, Kali Akuno said that this is a battle to take ideas seriously. And in this, I'm hearing so much about the ways in which the academy, and I would say activist organizers, organic intellectuals work together, right, to create new narratives, to create new analyses so that we can learn our histories of social movements. We can learn our histories of how different models that have worked. I think this is one of the gifts that Jessica Gordon Nemhart gives us in her study of Black cooperatives, right? She helped us to really rethink Black struggle, not just as civil rights or revolutionary movements, but also movements for economic democracy. I'm thinking about people like Ella Baker and Yuri Kochiyama, who teach us so much about the importance of attending to people in the struggle and also about collective leadership. So there's so much that we can learn here. A second point that I'm hearing the panelists speak about is that what we need to be doing is building social movements, right? We need to be organizing for what some people might call mid-run, 10, 20, 25 years down the road. What are we going to be building? And I see so much. It's easier to pick the low-hanging fruit, right? To bring a speaker, to organize one event. Like Ben, I'm so happy that this event is a midway point and it's building to a much larger vision. But so often, and I have to critique us at the university, right? We're good at bringing speakers, but we're not so good at using that platform to build something larger. So I think that really needs to happen. A third thing, well, I guess I'm going to say four now. A third thing is that we really need to have partnerships between the campus and the community. And sometimes this gets talked about as if we're separate, and we're not, right? Like, I'm a scholar, I live in a community, my children go to the schools, I'm a community activist. Like these are not separate things, but how do we intertwine them better? And fourth, I heard questions about questions of scale, geographies of scale, right? How much we need to be working locally, but how do we tie that to scaling up so that we aren't just doing community gardens, which are wonderful. They produce food. I think they're healing. I think getting our hands dirty is really healing. But also, how do we scale up, right? How do we get city councils? How do we get the federal government to provide funding for these kinds of things, which are really, really difficult? How do we scale up? Because the event is titled The Academy and the Next Systems, and because I work as a professor at a large public university system in California, I want to make a few comments about changes within the university. And the first thing I want to say is that the university is a highly contested space. Sometimes I feel like I hear about it as if it is like, oh, we produce knowledge or something. There's so much struggle that goes on. And one of the struggles that's happening that I see right now is that there is great movement towards, in the language of the university, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And on one hand, it is great to see that we're not struggling over, right? Does race matter, right? We're not working in that colorblind environment, I don't think, any longer. But of course, we know there are other kinds of struggles and difficulties that come with this. And one of them is that there are grants that provide diversity, that work to foster diversity work. There are efforts to have community engaged work count as part of one's biannual faculty reviews. There are awards for diversity. This can be used, right, to promote far-reaching justice, but I think it can also be used to help people to just have an outcome, to engage with the neoliberal metrics so that we are doing things that we put down on our resumes or our CVs rather than this long haul work that's slow and messy, that we often do a lot of things that end up producing no noteworthy outcomes, right? That we can't put down on our resumes. And I think that that's fine. I think that why should we be looking for rewards from the institutions if we are seriously trying to transform those institutions? So I think it leaves for many of us this question of, right, do we just work through, I'm talking about academics, right? Do we work through the structures of the university and try to push them out a little bit, but really maybe not that much? For many activist scholars, the question of do we leave the academy, right, and work in the social movements is a real one. And then I think there's also the question of what is important about the space of the university and why might it require attention, right? And Gar spoke to this some about the need to create institutions if we're going to be able to scale up. And for me, there's another reason why I am continuing to work in the university and trying to make change within it as well as outside of it. And that is an article that was very inspiring to me is by Barbara Tomlinson and George Lipsitz called Insubordinate Space for Intemperate Times. And they have a book of a similar name. And in this article, came out in 2013, they're critiquing the formidable impact of neoliberalism at the university and in our collective lives, right? And of course, we know that neoliberalism as political economy has created, right, produced this gig economy that has led to the adjunctification and part-timization of faculty, right, which is increased economic precarity and lower wages. But neoliberalism isn't just an economic system. And Barbara Tomlinson and George Lipsitz write about the unimpeded capital accumulation requires extensive ideological legitimation. And this is part of the work of the university, right? On one hand, to legitimate dominant systems of inequities and market-driven values that infiltrate the whole society. And on the other hand, the university can play an especially important role if we actively struggle for a different critical analysis and practice. So Barbara Tomlinson and George Lipsitz argue for the creation of insubordinate spaces that offer opportunities for critique and argument And this is what the university is supposed to be doing, right? And there is space there. And that's also why academics get attacked so viciously also. And also to create those practices and projects that can counter neoliberalism and its racial project. Stefano Harney and Fred Moten use a slightly different but related formulation in their book called The Undercommons, right? And they suggest a way to be in the university, but not of the university. That has been very helpful to me personally. And they want to work through the undercommons to create the maroons of the university, thinking like runaway slaves who created their own autonomous societies. How much we can do this and still be in the university is a challenge. That's one of those contested spaces. So it's never easy, it's never complete. But I want to give a few examples of things that are happening at the university that might move us in the direction of creating these insubordinate spaces that are able to harness the knowledge and resources and practical skills of those at the university that, as Mike Strode talked about, needs to be done in service to creating change in the world. And one thing that I am very clear about is that given the constant pressures of co-optation, absorption, and assimilation within any institution, right? It's not just the university, it could be nonprofits, it could be anything. It's important that we intimately are connected with the grassroots social movements that challenge and critique us and help us to keep our eyes on the most crucial issues of our times. Robin Kelly in Freedom Dreams reminds us that social movements are incubators of new knowledge, new theories, and new questions, and that the most radical ideas often grow out of concrete intellectual engagement with problems of aggrieved populations confronting systems of oppression. So I'm arguing for this intricate need to connect the academy with the grassroots social movements if we're going to create systemic change, right? So on my campus, I just want to talk about 3 examples of projects that I've been involved with. And I want to acknowledge that there's been a long history, right, of work on the campuses. And I'm located in Asian American Studies, and Ethnic Studies has been a project around for 50 years that has at its core social justice concerns. So one such project, 2 or 3 years ago at the Center for Black Studies Research, we implemented a year-long study on the Black radical tradition. And it was really powerful to read and have collective discussions. People may think that faculty, there's always colloquium and talks, but that we actually read together and in a year-long way and engage in these conversations. And coming out of this, people talked about how much it changed their thinking, teaching, writing, research. And we also connected with community-based groups such as in New Orleans, Students at the Center and the Freedom Foundations of Formerly Incarcerated Men to support a pedagogical project where these high school students in New Orleans, I mean, the students at the center were doing this, we just supported them and partnered in certain ways, were writing their own stories based on their own lives. And since New Orleans is kind of ground zero for the carceral state, everybody knew someone at Angola or someplace, somebody who was imprisoned. And their latest collection just came of writings, just was released in a book called Go to Jail. And if anyone wants the book or wants to know about it, please reach out to me. Second, the Multicultural Center and the Division of Social Sciences are partnering on this new intersectional justice certificate program. And we're bringing students and we're trying to figure out ways for community members to participate. I mean, community can participate. The question is how to cover the costs of this. That's what we're trying to figure out. But one of the classes is taught by a community organizer. And I think this is so crucial because many classes teach about the history of social movements. They teach really important critical analysis of historical and structural oppression. They can foster radical imagination, but most classes do not engage with the questions of strategizing for social change. How do we create campaigns? How do we really build for long haul social movement change? And the third example that I have is The Blum Center at UCSB has a new initiative, Cooperative Economics. And I also, as Ben mentioned, helped to start a year ago exactly, a Cooperation Santa Barbara, which Kali Akuno will recognize as inspired by Cooperation Jackson and his fabulous co-edited book, right, Jackson Rising. And we started it like so many co-ops start in terms of at a moment of struggle and a moment of stress, right? And so we did it at the beginning of the pandemic just because it needed to happen, not be, it was ideas that we had been thinking about for a long time, but we didn't get to do the kinds of planning that would really be great, except if we did, I don't know what we would have even been launched yet. And we're trying to do food security, working with the regenerative agricultural methods on a local farm based on a land trust property, and working to get organic, nutrient dense, locally grown foods out to populations who usually don't have access to organic, high priced foods, right? And so in Santa Barbara, right, contrast to the image, we are majority working class Chicano Latino immigrants, and so that's some of the group as well as BIPOC communities that we would try to get this out to. And also I want to say, coming out of the pandemic, it's so clear to me the kinds of traumas that people, myself, all of us have been going through the last year, since 2016, 2013, 2011, 2003, and that coming out of this year of shutdown, if we don't deal with our traumas and our isolation, I think we're going to have a lot more conflicts. And so thinking about, can we develop a health and wellness co-op? And I think it's really possible here in Santa Barbara. I don't know how much time I have. I wanted to ask 4 questions.
Yeah, why don't you pose the questions and
Okay.
and let's do that.
Okay, so 4 questions. One is, I believe that Black activists and intellectuals have been among the fiercest proponents of transformational systemic change and have fought the hardest for democratic models of liberation. And so I'm wanting to know about the ways in which systems change organizers and thinkers are incorporating the knowledge of Black activists and intellectuals. I'm thinking about people like Cedric Robinson, who wrote, right, Black Marxism, and demands that we think about racial capitalism so that Marxist or left or class-based ideas and race-based ideas have to be in conversation with each other. I'm thinking about Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore, right, who back in 1998 with Critical Resistance were already talking about the abolition of prisons. And I'm thinking about the Movement for Black Lives and their amazing vision statement, which you can find online, that gives so much for us to think about. Second, I want to think about and ask, in what ways are organizers and intellectuals bringing the histories and presence of colonialism and settler colonialism into our analysis and struggle? Third, I want to ask, building on feminist ways of knowing, and I would say Indigenous, African, Asian, and others, what methods, processes, structures have you found that help us to attend to both social relationships and collective care while building for transformative change? And fourth, nobody has talked about this on the panel yet today, but as we build, we are going to face backlash and repression and co-optation and absorption. And how are we building to address those kinds of issues?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Fujino. It's really wonderful to hear about what you've been up to in the past year since I left Santa Barbara, and to have, thank you for taking the time to share all these insights as well tonight. And I know as you were speaking, I was thinking that I'm not in a position to take notes on what you're saying, so that I'm, like many of my students, will be going back to watch the video again. And I have a lot of follow-up to do. Really appreciate the questions you posed and also the examples you gave. And I just want to say to everybody who's here that both Dr. Fujino and Dr. Best will be posing questions to the panelists, and then we'll be coming back to the panel for you all to respond. So that's the format and the way we're wrapping up tonight. I also just posted a response on the question of Cedric Robinson and racial capitalism to note that Sarin Mudliar, who I noticed is here, and there's a lot of amazing people who are here watching and paying attention tonight, who themselves have a lot to share. He's presenting on racial capitalism as part of a panel at the Post-Capitalism Conference at Humboldt State University in California is hosting this weekend. And I should have pitched that and let people know that that is happening this weekend. And if you Google Post-Capitalism Conference, I'm sure you can find it. And maybe we can include a notice about it in our follow-up to tonight. So thank you. Turn it over to my colleague, who I am feeling very lucky to call colleague, senior member of our faculty here at George Mason University and our department chair, Amy Best.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to serve on this panel. I'm so happy to be here. And I want to just a round of thanks to Representative Pocan and this really wonderful, thought-provoking panel. So Jane Addams, the formidable late 19th century sociologist and founder of settlement houses, wrote in 1922, "What, after all, has maintained the human race on this old globe, despite all the calamities of nature and the tragic failings of mankind, if not faith in new possibilities and courage to advocate for them?" This last year, we witnessed change and disruption of a tragic scale. The pandemic has certainly laid bare all sorts of institutional failures, those building blocks of society and the structures upon which stable collective life and democracy depend. The pandemic has also revealed the strength of collaborative action to reduce human suffering. And I think Mike's points about the sort of just the explosion of mutual aid is a really great example of that. Yet crumbling systems, fraying social bonds, creeping indifference, polarization that make possible populist foment, democratic backsliding, and what Case and Deaton termed deaths of despair had deep roots long before the pandemic. So there's so many lessons from today about alternate systems of cooperative and community enterprise that make possible economic democracy. And I am totally inspired by the cooperative infrastructure building, the solidarity economy network rooted in principles of place as alternatives to resource hoarding and the extractive logics of prevailing modes of exchange, whether you're talking about operating at the structural level or a mom gaming the system to make sure that her child is in gifted education, sort of operates at all these different scales. So we in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology believe that social science research has a really important role to play. In the words of Alondra Nelson, who's a sociologist and is the president of the Social Science Research Council, has turned this sort of the scaffolding of the new forms of social solidarity that are being called for in this moment. We think of social science as a public good that can promote social justice, inform equitable social policy, and support the types of durable and collaborative social infrastructure that enable new political and economic possibilities. At the Center for Social Science Research, which is the applied arm of our department, our priorities are strengthening civil society by supporting research initiatives that serve the public, build sustainable communities, and promote dignified lives, that foster scholar practitioner engagements to respond to deep challenges confronting local and global communities. And as Mike was talking, I was thinking about how it's actually in the space of scholarship and practitioners together that innovations are made possible and the skill sharing occurs. And I can say that in the work that I do, mostly with food justice folks, the sort of learning that I encounter is deepens my understandings and my scholarly work. I mean, in unimaginable ways had I not been in that space. So we're also really interested to prepare the next generation of social scientists to be capable of imagining new social formations. And so we train them, some of them go on to academic positions, but we train them to move into think tanks, to work with social movements, and to move into government, whether that's the US Census, Department of Labor, and other organizations. I think it's really important that we think about governments as their political spaces, of course, where political decisions get made. There are also these spaces of work where there's all of these social scientists who are doing this work that reduces human suffering and protects against human vulnerability. So we launched our PhD program in public sociology in 2008 against the backdrop of the Great Recession. And we felt an urgency then, just as we do now, believing in the distinct tools of sociology as a conceptually driven but empirical discipline, right? And so we feel like we've got an expansive toolkit that can assist in imagining alternatives and in strengthening our existing institutions, but it depends on partnering. We tend to embrace a broad and inclusive notion of public sociology. So it's not about sort of narrowing down like, this is what public sociology is, but thinking in broad ways about where it can occur, with whom, and what it can look like. So one way for me has been to use research tools of systematic inquiry to support organizations in their missions, to strengthen their practice, to identify barriers for program impact, and offer explanatory tools to understand what about a program structure or the ecologies in which they're embedded are making them successful. And I think that the task of the academic in those partnerships is to situate, help to situate that work in broader organizational structures and historical contexts. But part of that means thinking through what it means to partner equitably and responsibly. Universities have their own extractive histories, as Diane was speaking to. And part of that also means creating spaces for students to engage that work and recognizing that as fundamental to their scholarly trajectory and not like an add-on. And so we've worked hard to do that. And sociologists spend a lot of time thinking about collective life, organizational formations and social action that facilitate the kind of stakeholder reciprocity, mutual aid networks, the types of collaborative political participation that builds social infrastructure and ensures functional safety nets. And we do a fair amount of diagnostic work, so problems identification. And I was listening to the panel, I was thinking about Nancy Fraser's work on the crisis of care. And one of my colleagues, Nancy Hanrahan, and a former student who's become a scholar in her own right, Sarah Amsler, have been studying teacher strikes, mostly by women in West Virginia and elsewhere. And they found that teachers are essentially engaged in triage as frontline workers responding to fraying communities in the context of post-industrial austerity. And that they're suffering under the kind of care extraction that is also in play when we talk about different kinds of extractive economies. In these community contexts, grandmothers, migrant domestic workers, mostly women of color, and teachers are the safety net. And the women teachers are motivated to strike, not because of feminist principles or even traditional labor concerns, but because they're exhausted by the social reproductive labor, which is the work of maintaining and renewing the lattice of social bonds, which make all forms of social cooperation possible. Social reproduction work has long been the work of women, and there's a sort of an assumption of an infinite reservoir of this care to be extracted. But it strikes me that the types of solidarity economy infrastructure that I'm hearing being talked about today has the power to address this crisis of care as well, and perhaps some of its gender baggage. And I think it's important that gender be kept in view in this conversation. But I was hoping, as one of my questions, there could be some response to this notion of a crisis of care. So I'd like to believe that sociologists, that we sort of tend to system level requirements, seeing the structures. And I think that we're actually less good at the sort of build out, and practitioners really are really good at that. And so I have a question about scale and the work of scale. And I was hoping that maybe Mike and Kali could in particular talk about it, because it does seem like you guys are scaling upward. And then my last question relates to the interconnections between civil society and the state. Because in a lot of these formulations, sovereignty and economic infrastructure is rooted in place and belongs to the community. And so where does the state fit in to that? So yeah, so I'll stop there. I'm hoping to. I want to hear some comments from the panelists. Thank you again for just a wonderfully productive set of ideas. So yeah, so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Amy. Thanks, Dr. Best, to sort of play the colleague and friend, and also the professional role there. I'm getting used to East Coast mores out here. Great questions. I hope that those of you who were major panelists were able to get some of those down to be able to respond. I want to give each of you a chance to respond. Let's take a couple minutes each. I heard some questions that were sort of more directed, so maybe we can step forward in that way and then open it up. And thank you, everybody, for making the time tonight. I don't know if I'll have a chance to say that collectively later on as we're wrapping up, but it is as many people are commenting in the chat, a collaborative effort, people coming together to make this discussion happen. And so thanks again. Who would like to start in terms of your responses to the academic response panel?
I have a thought.
Okay, go for it.
I think particularly responding to the last question, because I think the issue that I want to remind, if we're talking about the next system, we're talking about the level of abstraction called capitalism, socialism, fascism. So what the difficulty is relating what we know about organizing, which is critical, and union work. We know what we know about individual relationships to each other and to the work we do academically. But what we don't get to is systemic design. If you don't like capitalism and you don't like state socialism, what do you want? And why would it be better? And that's not present in our dialogue. My colleague, Gus Speth, published a collection of essays, The New System Reader, but trying to take these ideas, these critical, this is a very good discussion, but trying to take these to the level of how do we change the system? If this system produces inequality, racial discrimination, labor unions are now declined to 6% in the private sector, 11%, 10%, something overall. What is the next political economic system that we are building? How do we bring that forward into and integrated with the dialogue that we've begun to have? How do we take the issues of personal relationships, social development, the university and the academy towards the question of, can this system or another system do what we want in terms of value outcomes for the various constituencies? And that problem, I think, needs to be brought much more into the center of the dialogue, and it hasn't as yet. I'm very optimistic about how Black studies move from the margins to becoming institutionalized. So too with environmental studies, which never existed and became powerful in the academy, et cetera, et cetera. You go down the line. But I think the whole idea of changing the system, literally, as a very serious discourse rather than rhetoric, now needs to be interfaced with the dialogue we're having. So let me stop there for my kind of statement as a question.
Right. Thank you, Gar. Who's next? Appreciate it. I take it to Mike or to Kali. I heard a couple questions that were directed to the two of you.
I may have missed a couple of questions. I've been bombarded with digital education and homework.
Care work, yeah.
Questions. I will, first just echo what Gar offered. And we have been doing internally a bit of study on some of this design around that build and fight formula, and trying to, as I was, briefly articulating, just from our, vantage point, which is limited, but just, trying to put out some more ideas similar, or to complement those, to be included within those of, the next systems project, that, yeah, we have to do some actual thinking through of design, and what are the outcomes that we want, and to see how some of this is playing out, in the real world, so that we can make refinements and improvements. Others can pick it up. I think this is essential, because we need I think in this period of time, when I was talking about the battle of ideas, we need to be able to kind of clearly articulate what we are for, not just what we are against, but what we are for. And they have to rise and meet the challenge of the day. The piece around how do we organize, the millions of people who are not in labor unions now, is one of the fundamental challenges I think that's been before us all of my life. And I've been here 50 years now, close to 50 years. And it's one that I agree that co-ops in and of themselves is not going to solve, right? Because just that method alone won't reach the immediate scale, say within a decade, that will be needed. But there has to be some new ways that we can innovate to organize folks, to get them to look at transforming the workplace. And we need to think through that, I think, immediately. That's the only thing that I think is going to really tip the scales, because one of the challenges we know that co-ops still have, and we have this one in a myriad of different ways, is where I'm at, just trying to rely on member dues and member investment. It might work it's worked for us thus far with a few smaller entities, Arts Co-op Initiative, Guarding Initiative. But for something like our small, our community production cooperative, which is a small scale manufacturing cooperative, I mean, we're getting close to now, over the span of 3 years. We were just doing an evaluation that there's close to like $1 million now. In the grand scheme of things, that's kind of chump change. But for us, that's a major piece of investment, which if it wasn't for doing some fundraising and it wasn't for some generous donations, we couldn't have done with the resources in our community on its own. And this is where what we've been promoting, kind of a union co-op kind of alliance and initiative, trying to think there through, it has to come through. We've been trying to say that there's resources within, that the unions have, investment resources, a number of different things that they could use in an entirely different way to help fortify this particular sector. But we need to realize, for the broader transformation that I think many of us are hoping for and aiming for, even that within itself won't get us to where we need to go. So this question of scaling up, I think, is a critical one. And I heard that one, and even in the midst of the pandemic, we've been able to scale up, I think, pretty significantly, in 2 areas here in Cooperation Jackson. But is it meeting the actual employment needs of our community as a whole? No, it's not. We're just barely, scratching the surface, right? And we have to figure out how to scale this up within a model. We have some ideas, like with the community production piece. We want to see 5 or 10 of these, kind of operating in a coordinated network fashion within our community, so that there's production for a need, primarily for a number of different things, to both fit within ecological framework, et cetera. But then again, we have to figure out where are we going to get those resources from within the existing market economy and dynamics that we have to struggle with, and that we're contending with, in all the complications and contradictions that come up within it. That's where the system design piece has to really come up with some serious, solid answers. So right now, we have more answers than we have solutions. But I definitely echo that we need to be thinking through it and putting the time and effort to do so. The thought work is just as important as the grind work, is one of the things that I think I've learned in our 7 years in doing this experiment here in Jackson. So I'll close there.
Thank you, Kali. Who's next, Peter or Mike? Mike or Peter?
So I'll jump in and build on that question, the question of scale, because it's a term that I don't tend to use. I tend to think about replication, recognizing that the reach of the Healthy Food Hub, to sort of Kali's point about being able to serve the context of these neighborhoods in Southeast Chicago. The goal was never for the Healthy Food Hub to be a citywide hub. The goal was simply to figure out how this neighborhood could manage its own concerns around the food system, and then maybe federate and connect with other neighborhoods, other entities, work with the Pembroke Township farming communities, and be able to have a food system that was regionalized, but certainly could reach out further nationally beyond that sort of 500-mile local food system piece if it needed to. And then from there, recognize that as a framework, as a model that other communities could adopt. And that, as we were iterating, as we were experimenting, as we were testing, we could say, hey, these are the things that have worked. Here are some things you might want to try. And here's how we can support the implementation as it might exist in your community. So the goal is never the Amazon of food, right? Which is the sort of, we don't necessarily want scale. We want replicable, decentralized models that each community can tailor to its own needs. So that's one question. To Diane's question around the intersection with Black radical tradition and sort of the scholarship there. That for the spaces that I am in, that's always been a key part of the political education, and it's certainly now that we are seeing the intersection of that particular intellectual tradition with the cooperative, the sort of excavated cooperative knowledge. But certainly Renee Hatcher here locally with John Marshall Law School is doing a lot of work on racial capitalism and decolonizing nonprofits. And so I think that's certainly something that is showing up. And then similarly, with colonialism, decolonialism, many of us do have a notion of sort of this international ethos. So we are very connected to that language as well. And so that shows up very richly in I just said decolonizing nonprofits, right? Or, decolonizing business even. So it's very present. Whether or not, it's spoken about in the way that it's kind of happening in the sort of academic or in the scholarship, it's certainly a language, a framework and analysis that we think about as we are building out these systems, so even as I talked about the Healthy Food Hub, that was about decolonizing a food system that we recognized had left our community in Southeast Chicago without a grocery store for 7 years. And I was, as challenging as it was with the sort of mutual aid ramp up that happened inside of COVID in Chicago, I saw the benefit in all of these mutual aid projects, which now have federated into their own sort of food delivery networks, right? Recognizing and seeing the brokenness within the food systems as they've sought to keep food flowing in their communities, as they, and using whatever sort of government programs, have existed and trying to implement other initiatives. They are doing the same sort of experimentation that I saw happening at the Healthy Food Hub. And so it's really been important to bring those learnings from the Healthy Food Hub over to those networks. But again, all about replication, all about communities testing out what works in their context and then learning from each other and iterating from there. And I have something on the care work, about an experiment, that's happening in Cincinnati, which is talking about organizing daycare workers in such a way that they can then implement their own cooperatives. So, certainly there's some work happening around that with Co-op Cincy, but I do have one specific other project, that's recently launched, that is going to be working on some of that with Co-op Cincy. So, it's there. I am not necessarily deeply connected or sort of a part of that organizing, but, it's certainly organizing that I support, which is where I would see the care labor, coming into the equation. And you can kind of take that again as a framework, as a model that you apply to other forms of care. So perhaps there is a role for elder care. And I have an aging parent, so I recognize that I really want this elder care issue to be solved. And I want it to be solved cooperatively. So that's where I would pause.
Amen. Thank you, Mike. Peter.
So to address some of the issues that Diane raised, I mean, for us in the UE, most of the issues dealing around Black intellectuals and engagement with Black movements, settler colonialism, and feminist and social relations, we do in our day-to-day work in the union. As our union has evolved, it's never been afraid of tough questions or tough issues, regardless of what the membership thinks. Is that if the leadership of the union determines that it's discussions that our members need to have and engage in, we're not afraid and we're not opposed to having those tough discussions with people. So we've been having discussions around issues of Black lives for decades. We've been issues around the issues and the disempowerment of women for many, many years. And we try to do things both internally and externally within our union to address those particular questions. So that, for instance, we've been having a decades-long effort in the South, both in North Carolina specifically, but also now in Virginia. And we do a lot of work with and we are one of the founders of the Southern Workers Assembly, because from our perspective as a union, the trade union movement can't grow and can't move forward without the critical piece of work of workers in the South. And to give them and for those workers to be empowered to be able to take over their own workplaces, to be able to control their own lives in that kind of way. So for us, those kind of issues are paramount in our work. And we see certain sectors of the economy and of our community as being key to that work. I was just on the issue of settler colonialism and in engaging people in other systems and in other countries. We have a very robust international department in our union. The difference is, for us in our international work, is that we involve rank and file members in all of our international work. It is the focus of our international work. So we send members to Japan, to Mexico, to Brazil, to Europe, to Canada on a regular basis to expose them to different cultures and to different people and different ways of doing things. And from our perspective, and I believe I've seen it personally myself, it changes people. When people go to Japan, for instance, or to Mexico, and they see how the relationship of the trade union movement and workers is to society, it changes them when they come back. And they want to ask the question, why can't we have that? And even within our own borders, we send workers down to the South to engage in organizing campaigns, white workers on purpose, for them to be able to see the conditions that Black workers work under in the South, which is substantially different than the North. Despite the fact that wages and benefits are now becoming more equalized than we've seen in the past, the relationship of forces is very different in the South than it is in the North in many respects. I want to address this issue of the backlash and just why I personally didn't mention it. Our union is one of two unions that survived the McCarthy era. So we're kind of used to a backlash, we expect it. So I guess maybe that's why we don't talk about it. It was just sort of there, and it's something that you deal with on a day-to-day basis the best you can. The key for us, though, is how do you develop educational programs within the labor movement that is deep enough so people are prepared to deal with the backlash? It's just like for us an organizing campaign. When you're going to an organizing campaign, a key part of the campaign is inoculating people to what the tools and tricks and strategies that the employer will put upon us, and to give us the tools to be able to defeat those lines that the employer puts out there. I see this work that we're doing politically and geopolitically in very similar ways, which is very, very deep education that I think the movement is only now beginning to engage in a really substantive way that is very, very, I think, very important. I think there's a huge issue in the crisis of care and the lack of empathy that exists in our society, and is directly related to a capitalist system. And I think it's very difficult for many people when we're dealing in such an individualized individualized culture for us to be able to develop into a more collective culture. And I think the trade union movement is part of doing that. Because if there it is, I mean, there are slogans within the labor movement that, despite its drawbacks, are still sort of are key to our core. solidarity forever, injury to one who is an injury to all. So there are issues of solidarity and of working as a community that we can build on within the labor movement and just talk about it in different ways. Lastly, in terms of the discussion on the sovereignty in the state, from my perspective, personally, as an organizer who has to deal with the state, as an organizer, I had to deal with the state on a lot of different levels. Our relationship was always one of, we need the resources that you can provide in many ways that a national union can provide, but you need to trust us to be able to utilize those resources in a way that we see fit better. More often than not, though, when you ask for resources, they ask for demands back that may or may not be detrimental to the work that you're doing. And it's a real drawback. And I think this is really part of the overall forward-moving political project that we have, which is to elect leaders and to have people in power who have resources that will give us the ability to access those resources and access that power in ways that will help us build power in our own workplaces. And that for them to understand that we know better than they how to do that, but we need their resources in order for that to happen.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks to each and all of you tonight. This, I have to say, was a very systemic conversation. There were few boundaries that were not crossed. In fact, many of those boundaries were not even imagined, I think, in our conversation. And I think that is very promising. I owe an apology to the political sociology section of Sociology because I owe them an article for their newsletter, our newsletter. I'm a member of that section on the effort to build next system studies. And one of the difficulties that I will be writing about when I get that to them tomorrow has to do with the fact that next system work unavoidably involves bringing in all the different disciplines and all the different practical experiences at all levels of society, from the very local and the individual and the personal and the communal to the global, right? And our work here at George Mason University in building this means that we've been outreaching to business and to the public policy school and the peace studies folks and sustainability, and working to build a conversation in which all the expertise and knowledge comes into play. The insights that you all shared, I know, are going to be very influential, not only for me, but for many students and colleagues and community organizers and activists who are here tonight. Hopefully some of you saw that some of our students in sociology here were commenting, very excited, many undergraduates and graduate students here to get into building next system studies at the Academy. And that makes me excited as well. So I'm looking forward to our next steps together. And I wish we were in a room together so we could all applaud, give hugs, clasp arms, or whatever we do, probably all those things. But thank you so much. And have a great evening, everybody.
All right.
Solidarity forever.
Appreciate it.